So for the compensation or this review, the external equity piece of this study, we conducted a salary survey. So what we did was created a salary survey document that we actually sent to peers, and we collected range data from these 13 peers that you have, that we have here listed. So we collected that minimum to maximum salary range data. Okay. From that, for the 40 benchmark classifications, which was a subset of all, which is a very typical way of doing salary surveys, we compared that data, average all together. We had at least 5 for most peer responses, but 3 at a minimum. For the data that we collected, we found that overall, taking overall, this doesn't mean that every single classification was ahead or behind by this, but overall, your structure then, when you look across all of the data that we collected for those 40 benchmark classifications, at the minimum was 14% behind, 10% at the midpoint, and 2% at the maximum. So overall, you can definitely say the structure itself, if you're wanting to be competitive, probably needs to be brought up to a more competitive position. Again, if you notice here, we made this point again that the midpoint is typically considered market, as I mentioned before. So there again, at the midpoint, your structure is about 10% off. Again, does not mean that all classifications are ahead or behind. They vary, but. We also did a smaller collection, or really not a collection, but looking at the data that we have available to us. We subscribe to something called Economic Research Institute, which is salary survey data for the private sector. So we can do that for the local area and collect for those positions that are more easily transferable, if you will, to the public sector, whether or not they were ahead or behind, whether or not you were ahead or behind those positions. So overall there, you were 6.2% behind, 9.2, and 5.2 at the minimum, midpoint, and maximum. Now there, that probably doesn't show quite as much because you had these 84% range spreads, and the private sector ranges are typically about 100%. And now that I just said that, when the peer data, the peers pay ranges, were about 64.7% range spreads. So again, your 84 was a little bit larger than most of the peers when you go across looking at those. So again, taking into consideration that what you would like to do, have this open range plan, we developed a new competitive, I'll call it at market, open range pay plan. Just a few quick comparisons. Your current pay grades, you had 24, we've got 22. It's about the same, just didn't need to have a couple of those that we probably had, and it's just the way we do the progressions, etc. And again, your current range spreads are 84, so we proposed a 55 to 65. So as you go through, I didn't show it here on the slide, but starting at the lower end of the pay range, the widths are 55, and then they go up to 65. Because as you go along or move typically through the career to higher levels, you don't typically move from pay grade to pay grade as much. You might need more pay range width in that. So this is again another typical design, if you will, of a typical open range pay structure. So again, it's easy to administer. You have a minimum, midpoint, maximum. Keep your salaries, at least at the minimum, and typically don't go over the maximum. That's it could be another conversation, but and again, looking at the midpoints, when we assigned classification to the pay grades, that would be the midpoint, typically market point at which employees assigned to classifications in the pay grades would expect to be paid, or hope to be paid, maybe I would say. So utilizing that new structure, we individually assigned classifications. So we took that structure, we looked at the internal, at what I referred to before, that JAT score. It's actually a data point, compensable factor score. We looked at the external market results, conduct something called regression analysis, come up with what we would believe those projected midpoints should be for each classification, and assign a pay grade for each of those. Now, we have to kind of go back and forth, look at the hierarchy, make sure we don't have anything out of line. It's not just taking that, even that mathematical calculation going with that. We have to use our heads sometimes and go, okay, well, that would put this one still too far out of range, so we've got to keep that within the internal structure. But we do individually, so it's not like we take the results and just move everything, because we need to move some of the positions as much, or maybe we need to move others more if you understand that, to make those competitive. So after doing that, we then said, okay, so what would be the most appropriate options, if you will, for implementing the new pay plan? And again, all being, considering what you could possibly fiscally afford, if you will. This first one is what we call bring employees' salaries to new minimums. If you're going to implement the new structure, which of course we'd hope that you could do, then you would need to at least bring current employee salaries to those new minimums, get them in that structure. So to do so, that was 50 employees who needed to have that adjustment. So this 119, roughly 119,000 annually, estimated annually, is what it would take to do that. So just to what I call turn the system on, get it in place, at least get those employees who need to be brought to the minimum, the cost would be 119,000. That does not include the cost of benefits to that salary only. So these next two options, so if you could do something more than that, if you will, maybe look at it that way. These next two options are just two different variations of something we call move toward midpoint or move toward market. What we're doing with this kind of fairly complicated but not so complicated formula is taking employee salaries where they are now, in relationship to where they would be to the new midpoints, coming up with what we call a compa ratio, and saying based on that and based on how long they've been with the city, try to move them, adjust them a little bit more towards those midpoints. So it's trying to do what we found in that back on that other slide, where those salaries are kind of clustered in that first quartile, and move them a little bit more towards that midpoint or towards market. We have what we call a two-tier approach, which just takes a tenure of less tenure, total tenure time, and people with less than 10 years. And then we have, just flip into it for a minute, the three-tier. So we just take the tenure and cut that a little bit more into three different groupings, if you will. Those are less than 3 years of tenure, 3 to 7, and over 7. So with those, as you can see, the cost differs. It's a little bit lower to do the two-tier option, the three-tier, 322,000 with the three-tier. That would, again, try to move some of those salaries, give them a little push, I call it, more towards the midpoint, which goes in line, I believe, what you would hope to be trying to do, to have a structure that's more competitive and get salaries a little bit more competitive. This approach, if you will, is fairly, I'm going to call it popular now with our clients, because it's not perfect. Nothing's going to be perfect, and nothing tries to make up for time. You could or couldn't, do everything possibly, but it does try to kind of, again, move those salaries a little bit more off that mark, and takes into consideration, however, tenure as well. If you wanted to consider one of these options, but said, well, we really could not swing that cost, but we could maybe do something different. Could you look at coming up with some other things? There's all sorts of things once you start calculating the math. The math here, once we've got these formulas in there, well, let's limit this to at least X percent or what have you for employees. We can do some other things if you feel so inclined to ask us to do that. We could look at some other variations of this as well. But these two options beyond that, what we call bring employees to minimum, are trying to, again, kind of help that in that new structure, employee salaries. additional recommendations, again, with the idea that you would be able to implement the new structure, and even if not, communicate the study results to the employees, and we can give you some help with that as well. Continuously really review your pay practices, and review is necessary to align again with your philosophy, be fiscally responsible and competitive with the peers. Administer and maintain the new plan. Anything that you put it in place, again, if you maintain that. So if you found a position that was falling behind in the market and did say it's really the structure, you need to move that. Maybe it's conduct a quick salary survey and adjust that pay grade for that one classification. You don't necessarily have to move the whole pay structure every year or anything like that. In fact, we don't typically recommend it. I should make the point, I didn't yet, that we design these to be, I'm going to call it good for about 3 years. So for about 3 years, you should not have to do if you could implement this, anything with your plan. What we're finding is in about a 3-year time period, it might, this is based on the data we've had lately with conducting some what we call compensation updates for some of our previous clients, it may change about 1% pay ranges generally, okay? But you probably don't need to do that. Your salaries are probably what you need to pay a little bit more attention to than necessarily the structure. I don't think the structure's going to hinder you if you didn't change that, is what I'm saying. I think that makes sense. Again, we got structure and you've got employee salaries. But so if you do that and conduct a study every 3 to 5 years, and in 3 years, you would maybe just need to do what we call a compensation update. We or somebody else would do a salary survey and just see if the whole plan needs to have some adjustment at that time. 5 years maybe to do the whole classification like we did here. Okay.
Actually, you got something?
Yeah.
You go.
I've noticed that benefits were not included in this. It was just basically salary. Would that not make a difference if benefits were included in it, such as medical insurance, VRS?
Yes, we weren't contracted to do benefits, so let me say that, okay?
Okay.
And it could. I rarely, this is going to sound like, rarely see where benefits make a huge difference, an overwhelming difference, in that if you're attracting employees, a significant amount of employees, or losing employees, one or the other, based on a benefit or not based on a benefit, being able to, give a benefit, if you will, then I'd say yes, that would make a difference. And maybe we would say, well, then maybe you don't need to be as competitive or what have you because of a great benefits package, or need to be more competitive because of one that's not as good as others, if you will, okay? So it's kind of this bigger picture. I've had one client in the time I've been there at Evergreen that's literally, even when we do the benefit studies, that's happened, where it's like they were so rich in their benefits that I went, they were attracting people because of a particular benefit, just fairly significantly. And I went, well, they were thinking about reducing that benefit. I said, well, you could taper that off. But right now, you don't need to be ahead of the market in salary. And I believe that might be your point. Just be competitive in your salary while you're, slowing that down. You don't need to be high in both necessarily. So yes, it does matter, but from the discussions we had, I didn't understand that we had a significant, determining factor here in that.
Well, also, and 8 of the 12 peer respondents from the other cities also are much larger in population, and that type of thing. So naturally, the larger the locality, the more that they're going to be able to compensate their employees. And that brings that average up. I mean, we're small. And ergo, I think, if you've taken a look at some places like Buena Vista, et cetera, that are closer to our population, I think that would have brought down some of what you have shown us there with your numbers.
The difference.
Yes.
So, absolutely understand that. So here's the the conversation around that. what are, I understand the point, well taken, and we were probably understood that, and I'd say we were conservative with our pay structure and pay grading because of that. Okay, knowing that, knowing you're not the same, you can't do as much, whatever. But this is any employer, anybody. You are still potentially competing with those people, whether or not you can or cannot afford to do it.
Well, historically speaking, the private sector always pays more than the government.
Exactly.
We're considered low-paying jobs anyway, but we've tried to compensate them as much as
Yeah.
we can. Plus, at the end of the year, we've been giving out a longevity bonus. This year, that totaled about $144,000, which out of 100 employees is a pretty good amount, you know. In
Yes.
fact, it was a 35% increase over what we gave them the previous year. So, I mean, can't that be factored in as well?
Yes, and again, not, so, I would look at it as this. This is the data. It's a decision point really to say, do we want to try at least get our structure competitive? I kind of go to that, maybe you can't compete at the same level on the salaries as much. But get the structure there, have it available, have it at least be competitive. If you can do something more than what I call that bring them in, then do that. But knowing exactly what you just said, yes, that's what I'd be like, hey, my opinion, just reviewing that would be yes. Just at least get your structure updated a little bit. bring that to the competitive position, and then if you can do something more, do that. Or be cognizant, maybe that, of the fact that you've got a great cluster of employees still, you know, towards that minimum.